Jack Morrison had been staring at the same newspaper ad for 3 days straight. His coffee had gone cold again, but he couldn't look away from those words that seemed too good to be true. 800-acre Montana ranch for sale. Includes livestock, equipment, and Victorian home. Serious buyers only. Price to sell fast. The asking price was half of what Jack expected to see. After 30 years of ranching in Texas, he knew land values better than most people knew their own phone numbers. Something like this should cost at least double what they were asking. Maybe even triple. Jack's weathered hands shook slightly as he reached for his phone. Not from nerves, but from the excitement that had been building in his chest for days. At 45, he thought his dreams of owning a real ranch again were over. The bank had taken everything from him 2 years ago. His family's ranch, the one his grandfather had built from nothing, was gone. Sold to pay off debts that had piled up faster than snow in a blizzard. The divorce had made everything worse. Linda hadn't just taken half of what little he had left. She'd taken his confidence too, told him he was a failure who couldn't provide for his family. Maybe she was right. Maybe he really had lost his touch with the land and the animals. But this ad, this impossible deal in Montana, felt like a second chance from God himself. Jack had been living in a tiny apartment above Murphy's feed store in Amarillo, working for other ranchers and dreaming of the day he could get back on his own land. He'd saved every penny for 2 years, living on beans and cheap coffee, wearing the same 3 shirts until they were more patches than original fabric. The money he'd managed to save wasn't much, but it was exactly what this Montana ranch was asking for, down to the last dollar. It felt like fate was finally smiling on him after years of storms. He dialed the number with fingers that fumbled on the buttons. His heart was beating so fast he could hear it in his ears. A woman answered on the second ring. Her voice was soft and musical, with just a hint of sadness that made Jack want to comfort her somehow. "Hello, this is Elena speaking. Ma'am, I'm calling about the ranch for sale. The ad in the paper?" There was a pause, and Jack heard what sounded like a soft sigh. "Oh yes, the ranch. Are you seriously interested? I've had so many people call just to waste my time." "I'm very serious, ma'am. I've got cash in hand and I'm ready to make a deal." Another pause. "Well, I suppose you could come look at it, though I have to warn you it's quite remote. Some people find it too isolated." Jack almost laughed out loud. Too isolated? He'd grown up on a ranch where the nearest neighbor was 10 miles away and the closest town was 40. Isolated sounded like heaven to him. "Distance doesn't bother me none, ma'am. When would be a good time to come see it?" "How about this weekend, Saturday morning? I could meet you there and show you around." Jack wrote down the directions with hands that were steady for the first time in months. As Elena gave him the details, her voice seemed to grow even sadder. She mentioned something about needing to sell quickly because she couldn't bear to stay there after her husband passed away. "I'm real sorry for your loss, ma'am," Jack said, meaning it. He knew what it felt like to lose everything that mattered. "Thank you," Elena whispered. "It's been very difficult. Harold loved that ranch more than anything in the world. Well, almost anything." The way she said it made Jack's chest tighten with sympathy. This woman was clearly suffering, trying to be strong while dealing with grief he couldn't even imagine. It made him want to help her somehow, to take the burden of selling the ranch off her shoulders. That Saturday morning, Jack loaded his pickup truck with everything he owned. It wasn't much. A few boxes of clothes, his grandfather's old saddle, some books, and a picture of his family from better days. If this ranch was half as good as it sounded, he wasn't planning on making a return trip to Texas. The drive to Montana took him through some of the most beautiful country he'd ever seen. Rolling hills gave way to towering mountains that seemed to touch the sky itself. The air got cleaner and colder as he drove north, and Jack found himself smiling for the first time in years. He'd forgotten what hope felt like. It was warm and bright in his chest, making him sit up straighter and drive with more purpose. Maybe Linda had been wrong about him. Maybe he wasn't a failure after all. The directions led him down increasingly narrow roads until he was driving on gravel, then dirt. The ranch was definitely isolated, but that just made it more perfect in Jack's eyes. No nosy neighbors, No traffic, noise. Just the sound of wind through grass and the distant call of birds he couldn't name. When he finally saw the ranch, Jack had to pull over and catch his breath. It was exactly like something from a dream he'd had as a boy. The Victorian farmhouse sat on a small hill, painted white with green shutters and a wraparound porch that begged for a rocking chair and a cup of coffee. The barn was huge and solid, built from timber that had probably been cut from the very mountains surrounding the property. Cattle dotted the pastures like brown and black spots on a green canvas. They looked healthy and well-fed. The fencing appeared to be in good repair. There was even a small creek running through the middle of the property, sparkling in the morning sunshine. Jack sat in his truck for a full 5 minutes, afraid that, if he blinked, it would all disappear like a mirage. This was the kind of place he'd dreamed about owning someday. The kind of ranch that could support a family for generations if it was managed right. A car was parked near the house. Someone was sitting on the front porch, waiting for him. Jack straightened his best shirt and ran a hand through his graying hair before walking up the gravel path to the house. The woman who stood to greet him took his breath away in a completely different way than the ranch had. Elena was beautiful in a way that seemed almost too perfect for such a remote place. Her black hair fell in waves past her shoulders, and her green eyes were the exact color of the pastures surrounding them. But it was the sadness in those eyes that hit Jack the hardest. This was a woman carrying a heavy burden of grief, trying to be brave when all she wanted to do was cry. "You must be Jack," she said, extending a delicate hand. "I'm Elena Blackwood." Her handshake was firm despite her small size, and Jack found himself holding on a moment longer than he should have. "Pleased to meet you, ma'am. I'm sorry it's under such sad circumstances." Elena's smile was grateful but tired. "Thank you. Harold always said that life goes on even when we don't want it to. The ranch needs someone who will love it the way he did." As they walked around the property, Elena told Jack about her late husband. Harold Blackwood had been 20 years older than her, a wealthy businessman who'd bought the ranch as a retreat from city life. He'd planned to retire there and raise cattle, but his heart had given out before he could fulfill that dream. "He died right there in the kitchen," Elena said softly as they passed the farmhouse. "I found him in the morning. The doctor said it was probably a heart attack brought on by stress. Harold had been working too hard for too many years." Jack noticed how Elena's eyes filled with tears when she talked about her husband, but she quickly wiped them away and continued the tour. She was clearly trying to stay strong, to handle the business of selling the ranch without breaking down. The more Jack saw, the more convinced he became that this was meant to be his place. The cattle were prime stock. The equipment was newer than anything he'd ever owned. The house had been recently renovated with modern appliances and heating systems that would make the Montana winters bearable. "Can I ask why you're selling for so much less than it's worth?" Jack finally said as they stood in the main pasture, watching the cattle graze peacefully. Elena was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the mountains. "I can't stay here," she said finally. "Every corner of this place reminds me of Harold, and honestly, I'm a city person at heart. I don't know the first thing about running a ranch. It would be wrong of me to let this place fall apart when someone like you could make it thrive again." She turned to look at Jack with those incredible green eyes. "Harold always said that land should belong to people who understand it. From the way you've been looking at everything, I can tell you understand this place already." Jack felt something shift in his chest. It wasn't just about the ranch anymore. This woman was in pain and he wanted to help her heal somehow. He wanted to take care of the land that her husband had loved, to honor the memory of a man he'd never met. "I can have the money transferred by Monday morning," Jack heard himself saying. "Cash, just like I promised." Elena's smile was the first, truly happy expression he'd seen from her all day. "Really? You want it?" "Ma'am, I've been looking for a place like this my whole life. If you're willing to sell it to me, I promise I'll take care of it like it was my own child." They shook hands again, and this time Elena held on longer. Harold would be so happy to know that someone who really loves ranching is going to live here. He always worried about what would happen to this place after he was gone. As they walked back toward the house to discuss paperwork, Jack felt like he was floating on air. In less than a week, he'd gone from living in a tiny apartment to owning 800 acres of the most beautiful land in Montana. He'd gone from working for other people to being his own boss again. Maybe this was what people meant when they talked about destiny. Elena invited. 3 weeks after moving to the ranch, Jack had fallen into a comfortable routine. He woke up before sunrise, made coffee in the big kitchen that still smelled faintly of the previous owner's aftershave, and walked out to check on the cattle. The Montana air was crisp and clean, filling his lungs with something that felt like pure hope. Every morning he stood on the front porch with his steaming mug and watched the sun come up over the mountains. It was better than any church service he'd ever attended. This was his sanctuary now, his chance to start over and do things right. The work was hard but satisfying. Fixing fence posts, checking on sick cattle, maintaining equipment that was newer and better than anything he'd ever owned. His hands, soft from 2 years of working indoors, quickly developed new calluses. His back ached in the good way that came from honest labor. The loneliness didn't bother him much. He'd grown used to being alone during the years after his divorce. Besides, he was too busy learning every inch of his new property to feel sorry for himself. The ranch was bigger than he'd realized, with hidden valleys and streams that didn't show up on any of the maps Elena had left him. He'd been thinking about Elena more than he should. Sometimes when he was working alone in the barn, he'd remember the way her voice had sounded when she talked about her dead husband. So much pain in those green eyes. It made him want to find her somehow, just to make sure she was okay. But Elena had been clear about wanting to start fresh in Denver. It wasn't his place to interfere with her new life, no matter how much he worried about her. That's why he was so surprised when he looked up from repairing a gate hinge one Tuesday morning and saw a familiar car coming up the dirt road. Jack wiped his hands on his jeans and walked toward the house, his heart beating faster than it should have been. Elena parked near the front porch and got out of her car slowly, looking around at the ranch like she was seeing it for the first time. She was wearing a simple blue dress that made her eyes look even greener, and her hair was pulled back in a way that showed off her delicate neck. Even from a distance, Jack could see that she looked tired, like she hadn't been sleeping well. "Elena," he called out, trying to keep his voice casual. "This is a surprise. How are you settling in Denver?" She turned toward him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hello, Jack. I hope you don't mind me dropping by unannounced. I was driving through the area and thought I'd see how you're getting along with the ranch." Jack noticed that her car had Montana license plates, not Colorado ones. If she'd moved to Denver 3 weeks ago, wouldn't she have gotten new plates by now? But maybe she just hadn't had time to deal with the paperwork yet. "I'm doing great," he said, gesturing toward the pastures where his cattle were grazing peacefully. "The animals seem happy, and I fixed most of the little problems I found around the property. You and your husband built something really special here." Elena's face tightened slightly when he mentioned her husband, but she nodded. "Harold put his heart and soul into this place. I'm glad it's in good hands now." They walked around the property together, with Jack pointing out the improvements he'd made and Elena asking questions that showed she knew more about ranching than she'd let on during their first meeting. She noticed things that most city people would miss, like the quality of the grass in different pastures and the condition of the equipment in the barn. "You've been busy," she said as they stood near the creek that ran through the middle of the property. "Harold always said this was the perfect spot for a ranch because of the water source." He was right, Jack agreed. "I've never seen cattle this content. The grass is rich, the water's clean, and there's enough shelter for them when the weather turns bad." Elena was quiet for a moment, watching the water flow over the rocks. "I've been having trouble sleeping in Denver," she said suddenly. "The city is so noisy and there are people everywhere. I forgot how peaceful it is out here." Jack felt that familiar urge to comfort her, to somehow ease the sadness that seemed to follow her like a shadow. "Are you thinking about moving back? To Montana? Maybe not here, but somewhere quieter than Denver?" She looked at him with an expression he couldn't read. "I don't know what I'm thinking anymore. Everything feels so uncertain since Harold died. I keep making plans and then changing my mind." Without thinking about it, Jack reached out and touched her arm gently. "That's normal after losing someone important. My grandmother used to say that grief makes us strangers to ourselves for a while." Elena's eyes filled with tears and she didn't pull away from his touch. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." She was. She also used to say that healing takes time, and you can't rush it by running away to new places. They stood there by the creek for several minutes, not talking, but comfortable in each other's presence. Jack found himself studying Elena's profile, the way the afternoon light caught in her dark hair and highlighted the delicate bones of her face. She was beautiful, but it was more than that. She had a quality that made him want to protect her, to shield her from whatever pain she was carrying. "Would you like to stay for dinner?" Jack asked impulsively. "I'm not much of a cook, but I make a decent beef stew." Elena hesitated, and for a moment Jack thought she was going to say no. Then she smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. "I'd like that very much. It's been a long time since I had a home-cooked meal." They spent the evening in the big kitchen, with Jack cooking while Elena told him stories about her life before she married Harold. She'd grown up on a small farm in Nebraska, the daughter of parents who'd struggled to make ends meet. When she was 18, she'd moved to the city looking for a better life and met Harold at the restaurant where she was working as a waitress. "He was so sophisticated," she said, helping Jack set the table. 20 years older than me, successful, confident, about everything. He made me feel like I could be more than just a farm girl who'd never been anywhere." Jack could hear the love in her voice when she talked about her husband, but also something else. A kind of wistfulness, like maybe the sophisticated city life hadn't been everything she'd hoped for. "Did you ever miss the farm?" he asked. Elena nodded. "More than I expected to." Harold tried to understand, but he was a city person through and through. "That's why he bought this ranch, actually. He thought it would help me feel more at home. But we only got to spend a few months here before." She trailed off, staring down at her plate. Jack reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make you sad." "You didn't," Elena said, turning her hand palm up so their fingers intertwined. "It feels good to talk about him with someone who understands what this place meant to us." After dinner, they sat on the front porch watching the stars come out. The Montana sky was clearer than anything Jack had ever seen in Texas, with more stars than seemed possible. Elena curled up in Harold's old rocking chair, wrapped in a blanket Jack had brought from inside. "I used to sit out here with Harold every night," she said softly. "He'd tell me about his plans for the ranch, all the things he wanted to do when he retired. He had such big dreams." "What kind of dreams?" "He wanted to raise prize-winning cattle, maybe breed horses too. He talked about turning part of the land into a guest ranch where city people could come experience real ranch life. He thought it would be good for both of us. Give me a chance to share my farming background and give him a way to stay busy in retirement." Jack could picture it. The ranch was certainly big enough and beautiful enough to attract visitors from all over the country. "That sounds like a wonderful plan. Did you want to do that too?" Elena was quiet for a long time. "I don't know what I want anymore," she finally said. "When Harold was alive, I wanted whatever he wanted. Now I have to figure out what Elena wants, and I'm not sure I remember how to do that." They talked until almost midnight, sharing stories about their childhoods and their dreams for the future. Jack found himself opening up to Elena in ways he hadn't with anyone since his divorce. She was easy to talk to, a good listener who asked thoughtful questions and seemed genuinely interested in his life. When Elena finally said she needed to get back to her hotel in town, Jack walked her to her car. They stood close together in the cool night air, neither one seeming to want the evening to end. "Thank you for tonight," Elena said, looking up at him with those incredible green eyes. "I haven't felt this relaxed since Harold died." Jack wanted to kiss her. The urge was so strong it was almost painful. But she was a grieving widow, and he was just the man who'd bought her husband's ranch. It wouldn't be right. "You're welcome. Here anytime," he said instead. "I mean that. If you ever need a place to get away from the city noise, you know where to find me." Elena smiled and stood on her tiptoes to kiss his cheek. Her lips were soft and warm, and Jack caught a hint of her perfume, something floral and feminine that made his head spin. "I'll remember that," she whispered, then got in her car and drove away into the darkness. Jack stood in his driveway for a long time after her taillights disappeared, touching the spot on his cheek where she'd kissed him. He was in trouble, and he knew it. Elena Blackwood was the kind of woman who could make a man forget all his common sense. Over the next 2 weeks, Elena found more reasons to visit the ranch. She came to pick up mail that was still being delivered to the old address. She knew Jack should have noticed the first warning signs when his prize bull, Thunder, died unexpectedly on a Tuesday morning in late October. The massive animal had been perfectly healthy the day before, grazing peacefully in the south pasture with the rest of the herd. But when Jack found him that morning, Thunder was lying on his side, eyes glassy and tongue hanging out. Dr. Peterson, the local veterinarian, couldn't find an obvious cause of death. "Sometimes these things just happen," he said, shaking his grizzled head as he examined the bull. "Could have been a heart attack, could have been something he ate. Without doing an expensive autopsy, we'll never know for sure." Jack was devastated. Thunder had cost him nearly $5,000, money he could barely afford to lose. But worse than the financial hit was the feeling that he was somehow failing as a rancher. In his 30 years of working with cattle, he'd never lost an animal without understanding why. Elena was there that day, helping him drag Thunder's body to where the rendering truck could pick it up. She was surprisingly strong for such a delicate-looking woman, and she seemed to know exactly what needed to be done. "I'm so sorry, Jack," she said, squeezing his hand as they watched the truck drive away with his dead bull. "Harold lost animals, too, especially in the first year. It's part of ranching life even when you do everything right." Jack appreciated her comfort, but something nagged at him. Elena talked about Harold's ranching experience like she'd been deeply involved in it. But when Jack had first met her, she'd claimed to know nothing about ranch work. Now she seemed comfortable with every aspect of farm life, from fixing equipment to treating sick animals. Maybe grief had confused his memories of their early conversations. Or maybe Elena was just a quick learner who'd picked up knowledge during her marriage. To Harold, 2 weeks later, Jack's tractor wouldn't start. The engine turned over fine, but something was wrong with the fuel system. When he opened the hood, he found sugar poured into the gas tank. Not much, but enough to clog the fuel lines and potentially destroy the engine if he'd kept trying to run it. "Kids," muttered Tom Bradley, the mechanic who came out to look at the tractor. "Probably some teenagers from town who thought it would be funny to mess with the new guy. We had problems like this when the Henderson place sold last year." Jack wanted to believe it was just a prank, but the timing bothered him. The tractor had been running fine until the day after Elena's last visit. She'd been the only person at the ranch besides him, and she'd been very interested in how all the equipment worked, but that was crazy thinking. Elena wouldn't sabotage his tractor. She cared about the ranch, cared about him. She was dealing with her own grief and trying to help him succeed where her late husband had dreamed of thriving. Still, Jack found himself watching Elena more carefully during her next visit. She moved around the ranch with confidence, touching equipment and examining animals like she'd been doing it her whole life. When one of his cows showed signs of illness, Elena suggested a treatment that worked perfectly. "Where did you learn about cattle medicine?" Jack asked as they watched the cow recover. Elena paused for just a moment before answering. "Harold taught me. He said a rancher's wife needed to understand every aspect of the business." It was a reasonable explanation, but something in Elena's eyes made Jack think she was hiding something. Or maybe he was just getting paranoid from spending too much time alone on the ranch. The strange incidents continued. Jack's water pump failed, flooding the basement of the farmhouse and causing thousands of dollars in damage. A section of fence collapsed for no apparent reason, allowing 20 head of cattle to wander onto the highway. His generator broke down during a power outage, spoiling a freezer full of meat. Each problem seemed to happen shortly after one of Elena's visits. Jack tried to tell himself it was just bad luck, the kind of mechanical failures that plague every ranch. But the pattern was starting to worry him. Worse than the equipment failures was what was happening to Jack himself. He'd started feeling sick in the mornings, dizzy and nauseous in a way that reminded him of having the flu. But the symptoms would fade by afternoon, only to return the next morning. Elena noticed his illness and insisted on taking care of him. She brought him special teas that she said her grandmother had used for stomach problems. She made him soup and fussed over him like a devoted wife, encouraging him to rest while she handled the ranch work. "You're pushing yourself too hard," she said one morning as Jack struggled to keep his breakfast down. "Harold did the same thing when we first moved here. The altitude and the stress of running a ranch can really take it out of you." Jack was grateful for Elena's care, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The illness had started around the time he and Elena had become romantically involved. Before that, he'd felt stronger and healthier than he had in years. The morning sickness got worse instead of better. Jack found himself spending more time in bed, relying on Elena to handle increasingly important ranch duties. She seemed happy to help, taking over the financial records and even negotiating with suppliers on his behalf. "You need to take better care of yourself," Elena said one evening as she brought him another cup of her grandmother's tea. "This ranch needs you healthy and strong." As Jack sipped the bitter tea, he noticed Elena watching him with an expression he couldn't read. For just a moment, her caring smile seemed to slip, replaced by something colder. But when he blinked and looked again, she was back to her usual concerned and loving self. Jack's suspicious nature, developed over 30 years of business dealings, finally overcame his infatuation on a gray November morning when he felt too sick to get out of bed. Elena had left early to run errands in town, claiming she needed to pick up supplies and check on some legal matters related to Harold's estate. Instead of staying in bed like Elena had insisted, Jack forced himself to drive to the county courthouse. If he was going to marry this woman, and they'd started talking seriously about that possibility, he wanted to understand more about her background. What Jack found in the public records shattered his world like a hammer hitting glass. Elena had been married before Harold. Not once, but 4 times. Her name had been different with each marriage. Elena Voss, Elena Patterson, Elena Rodriguez, Elena Chen. She'd changed her identity like other people changed clothes, moving from state to state and husband to husband. Each marriage had lasted between 1 and 3 years. Each husband had died unexpectedly. Heart attacks, accidents, sudden illnesses. Each death had left Elena a wealthy widow. Jack's hands were shaking as he printed out the records. The first husband, Robert Voss, had been a farmer in Iowa. Dead at 43 from a heart attack. The second, Michael Patterson, had owned a construction company in Nebraska. Dead at 51 from what was ruled an accidental fall. The third, Carlos Rodriguez, had been a successful restaurant owner in Colorado. Dead at 48 from food poisoning that the coroner had attributed to natural causes. The pattern was clear and terrifying. Elena wasn't just a grieving widow who'd happened to fall in love again. She was a serial killer who used marriage as a cover for murder. Harold Blackwood hadn't been her 4th victim. He'd been her 5th, and Jack was clearly meant to be number 6. The drive back to the ranch felt like the longest of Jack's life. Every mile gave him time to think about Elena's behavior, to see the warning signs he'd been too lovesick to notice before. The way she'd known so much about ranching despite claiming to be a city person. The way equipment seemed to fail after her visits. The morning sickness that had started when she began making him special teas and meals. Elena was poisoning him, slowly, carefully, making it look like the stress of running a ranch was affecting his health. She'd probably done the same thing to her previous husbands, gaining their trust and love while gradually killing them. When Jack reached the ranch, Elena's car was already parked in the driveway. She met him at the front door with a concerned expression that now looked fake and calculating to his newly opened eyes. "Jack, sweetheart, you look terrible," she said, reaching up to touch his forehead. "You should be in bed. Come on, let me make you some tea and soup." Jack forced himself to smile and nod. "That sounds good, Elena. I think I pushed myself too hard today." As Elena busied herself in the kitchen, Jack watched her with new understanding. Every movement seemed calculated. Now every smile seemed false. How had he missed the predatory gleam in those green eyes? Elena brought him a steaming cup of her grandmother's tea, the same bitter brew she'd been giving him for weeks. Jack accepted it with grateful thanks, pretending to sip while actually letting the liquid cool untouched. "Drink up," Elena encouraged, settling beside him on the couch. "You need to keep your strength up." Jack pretended to drink, making appreciative noises while his mind raced through possible plans. He couldn't confront Elena directly. If she was willing to kill 5 husbands, she wouldn't hesitate to speed up her timeline with him. He needed evidence, proof that would convince the police to take action. But first, he needed to stay alive, long enough to gather that evidence. Over the next few days, Jack became an actor worthy. Jack spent the morning of what could be his final day on Earth watching Elena prepare his lunch. She moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, humming softly as she chopped vegetables and seasoned the soup that would probably contain enough poison to finish him off. The woman he'd fallen in love with had never existed. In her place stood a calculating killer who'd been planning his death from their first meeting at the ranch. Every smile, every tender moment, every whispered word of love had been part of an elaborate performance designed to lower his guard and gain his trust. But Jack had advantages that Elena's previous victims hadn't possessed. He knew what she was, and he had the FBI backing him up. Hidden cameras had been installed throughout the house during the night, and agents were positioned in the woods surrounding the ranch. All he had to do was survive long enough to get Elena to confess. The wire attached to his chest felt cold against his skin. Jack had practiced keeping his voice natural while wearing it, but he wasn't sure how well he'd perform when faced with a woman who'd perfected the art of murder over more than a decade. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" Elena asked, bringing him a bowl of soup that smelled delicious and probably contained enough digitalis to stop his heart within hours. Jack forced himself to look weak and grateful as he accepted the bowl. "Not good, Elena. I think I'm getting worse. Sometimes I can barely catch my breath." Elena's smile was full of false sympathy, but Jack caught a gleam of satisfaction in her green eyes. "I'm so worried about you. Maybe we should call Dr. Peterson again." No, Jack said, pretending to be too proud to admit how sick he was. "It's probably just stress from learning to run this place. I'll be fine in a few days." As Elena watched expectantly, Jack lifted a spoonful of soup to his lips. The smell was overwhelming. Vegetables and herbs and something underneath that his body now recognized as dangerous. He pretended to swallow while actually holding the liquid in his mouth, then excused himself to the bathroom where he spit it out and rinsed thoroughly. When he returned to the kitchen, Elena was washing dishes with her back to him. "Finish your soup?" she said without turning around. "You need to keep your strength up." Jack dutifully ate the rest of the soup, using the same technique of pretending to swallow while actually disposing of each spoonful. It was exhausting work, but it was keeping him alive. Over the next several hours, Jack put on the performance of his life. He complained of chest pains and difficulty breathing. He stumbled when he walked and had to sit down frequently. Elena fussed over him with apparent concern, bringing him more poisoned tea and suggesting he rest in bed. "I think I should drive you to the hospital," she said as evening approached. "You're scaring me, Jack. Your color is terrible." Jack knew that a trip to the hospital would ruin the FBI's plan and probably get him killed before they could intervene. Elena had no intention of letting him reach medical help. She'd probably crash the car on the way there and make it look like an accident. "I don't trust those city doctors," Jack said, trying to look too weak to argue effectively. "Can you just stay with me tonight? I think I'll feel better in the morning." Elena's expression showed a flicker of impatience before returning to false concern. "Of course, darling. I'll take care of you." As darkness fell, Jack became increasingly convinced that Elena was preparing to finish him off. She kept checking on him every few minutes, studying his face like she was looking for signs that her poison was finally working. When he pretended to fall into a restless sleep, she stood in the bedroom doorway for a long time, just watching him. Around midnight, Elena went to the kitchen and returned with another cup of her grandmother's tea. This one smelled different, stronger and more bitter than usual. Jack suspected she'd increased the dose, preparing to end the charade once and for all. "Jack, sweetheart, wake up," she said, gently shaking his shoulder. "I made you something to help you sleep better." Jack forced his eyes open and tried to look confused and disoriented. "Elena, what time is it?" "It's late. Drink this. It will help with the pain." The cup in Elena's hands contained what looked like enough poison to kill a horse. Jack knew that if he drank even a sip of it, he'd be dead within minutes. This was the moment he'd been preparing for all day. "I don't think I can sit up," Jack whispered, making his voice as weak as possible. Elena set the cup on the nightstand and helped him into a sitting position. Jack let his head loll back against the pillows, breathing heavily as if the small effort had exhausted him. "There you go," Elena said soothingly, lifting the cup to his lips. "Just a few sips and you'll feel so much better." Jack parted his lips slightly, letting some of the liquid touch his tongue before jerking his head away. The bitter taste was overwhelming, confirming his suspicions about the increased dosage. "I can't," he gasped. "It tastes awful." Elena's mask of concern finally began to slip. "You need to drink it, Jack. All of it." "Why?" Jack asked, still pretending to be confused. "What's in it?" "Just herbs," Elena said, but her voice had taken on a harder edge. "Natural remedies that will help your heart." Jack let his eyes focus on Elena's face with apparent difficulty. "My heart? What's wrong with my heart?" Elena was quiet for a moment, studying Jack's face. Then she smiled, and for the first time since he'd known her, it was completely genuine. It was also the coldest, most frightening expression Jack had ever seen. "Oh, Jack," she said, her voice taking on a different quality entirely. "You poor stupid man, don't you understand what's happening to you?" Jack's heart was pounding, but he forced himself to maintain his act. "I don't understand anything anymore. I just feel so sick." Elena laughed softly, setting the cup back on the nightstand. "You're dying, sweetheart. You've been dying for weeks, ever since I started adding a little something extra to your food and drinks." There it was. The confession the FBI needed. Jack fought to keep his expression confused and frightened rather than triumphant. "What are you talking about?" he whispered. Elena stood up and began pacing around the bedroom, her demeanor completely transformed. Gone was the grieving widow, who'd needed comfort and protection. In her place was a predator who'd finally decided to stop pretending. "Do you really think I fell in love with you?" she asked, her voice full of amusement. "A broken-down cowboy with no money and no future? You were just another mark, Jack. Another lonely fool who thought he could save the poor widow woman." Jack let tears form in his eyes, though it wasn't difficult given the circumstances. "I don't believe you. We love each other." "We don't love anyone but myself," Elena said matter-of-factly. "I've been perfecting this routine for 12 years. Find a lonely man with assets worth stealing, make him fall in love with me, then slowly poison him until his heart gives out. You'd be amazed. How many widowers are desperate enough to believe that a woman like me could actually care about them?" She sat back down on the edge of the bed, reaching out to stroke Jack's forehead with false tenderness. Harold was the same way. So grateful for attention from a younger woman that he'd believe anything I told him. He thought I was devoted to him right up until the moment his heart stopped beating. Jack's blood ran cold. "You killed Harold too?" "Of course I killed Harold. Just like I killed Robert and Michael and Carlos and David. Just like I'm going to kill you." Elena's voice was conversational, as if she was discussing the weather. The beauty of digitalis is that it mimics natural heart failure perfectly. Even if doctors suspect poison, it's almost impossible to prove after the fact. Elena stood up again and retrieved the cup from the nightstand. "This final dose should do the trick. Enough to stop your heart within minutes. But not so much that. It will be detectable in your blood by the time they find your body." Jack realized that the moment of truth had arrived. Elena was done playing games, and if he didn't act soon, she'd force the poison down his throat and disappear before the FBI could move in. "Why?" he asked, trying to buy himself a few more seconds. "Why kill all those men? What did we ever do to you?" Elena's expression turned thoughtful. "You want to know the truth? The real truth?" Jack nodded weakly. "I enjoy it," Elena said simply. "The whole process from start to finish. Finding the target, making him fall in love with me, watching him trust me completely while I slowly kill him. There's a rush of power in it that's better than any drug." She leaned closer to Jack, her green eyes bright with excitement. "Do you know what the best part is? It's that moment when they finally understand what's happening to them. When they realize that the woman they trusted with their heart has been planning to stop it from beating. The look of betrayal in their eyes is absolutely intoxicating. Elena lifted the cup toward Jack's lips again. Harold had that look. So did Carlos, and David and all the others. Now it's your turn. Jack knew he was out of time. Elena was going to force him to drink the poison, and even if the FBI burst through the door in the next few seconds, it might be too late to save him. But he'd prepared for this moment. Hidden under his pillow was a small vial of syrup of ipecac, a substance that would induce immediate vomiting if he was forced to swallow any poison. Dr. Peterson had provided it along with instructions on how to use it safely. 6 months after Elena's arrest, Jack sat on his front porch watching the sunrise paint the Montana mountains in shades of gold and pink. The same view that had taken his breath away on his first morning at the ranch still filled him with wonder, but now it also brought him peace. The shadow of Elena's deadly presence had finally lifted from his life and his land. The trial had been a media sensation that Jack wished he could have avoided. Reporters from across the country descended on the small Montana town, turning Elena's story into headline news. The Black Widow Killer, they called her. The woman who turned marriage into murder. Jack hated the sensational coverage, but he understood that the public needed to know about predators like Elena. During the 3-week trial, the full scope of Elena's crimes became clear. The FBI investigation had uncovered evidence linking her to 8 murders spanning 12 years and 5 states. Each victim had been a lonely, wealthy man who'd fallen for Elena's carefully crafted performance of vulnerability and need. The prosecution painted a picture of a calculating predator who studied her targets like a scientist studying lab rats. Elena would research potential victims through social media, public records, and local newspapers. She looked for recent widowers, divorced men struggling with loneliness, and successful businessmen who seemed isolated from family and friends. Once she identified a target, Elena would reinvent herself to become exactly what that man was looking for. For Harold Blackwood, the wealthy businessman who'd bought a ranch, she became the farm girl who missed rural life. For Carlos Rodriguez, the successful restaurant owner, she became the aspiring chef who shared his passion for cooking. For each victim, she became the perfect woman, until it was time to kill them. Elena's method was almost foolproof in its simplicity. She would court her targets for several months, building trust and genuine affection while learning about their assets and legal affairs. Once she was confident of inheriting their wealth, she would begin the slow poisoning process using digitalis extracted from foxglove plants. The poison was nearly impossible to detect in someone who wasn't specifically tested for it. Even when doctors suspected something unusual about the deaths, Elena would be long gone by the time any investigation began. She had perfected the art of grieving just long enough to seem normal before disappearing to start fresh in a new state with a new identity. Dr. Amanda Foster, the forensic psychiatrist who evaluated Elena, testified that she showed classic signs of psychopathy: no genuine emotions, no capacity for empathy, and an inability to form real attachments to other people. Elena saw her victims not as human beings, but as obstacles to overcome and resources to harvest. She experiences what psychologists call predatory excitement, Dr. Foster explained to the jury. The process of hunting, manipulating, and ultimately destroying another person provides her with a rush that normal people can't understand. For Elena Voss, murder isn't just about money, it's about power and control. Throughout the trial, Elena showed no remorse for her crimes. She sat at the defendant's table with perfect posture and a calm expression, occasionally taking notes as if she was observing someone else's trial. The only time she showed any emotion was when the prosecution played recordings of her confession to Jack. And even then it was anger rather than shame. When Elena finally took the stand in her own defense, she tried to portray herself as a victim of abuse who'd been driven to desperate measures by cruel husbands. She claimed that each man she'd killed had mistreated her, and that she'd only used poison because she was too small and weak to defend herself physically. But the prosecution had done their homework. They presented evidence showing that Elena had been researching her victims long before she met them, that she'd purchased digitalis online months before each murder, and that she'd established false identities specifically to hide her trail of deaths. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Elena was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole, 8 consecutive life sentences to ensure she would never again walk free. As the judge read the sentence, Elena finally showed genuine emotion. Not remorse or sorrow, but rage. She screamed at Jack, blaming him for destroying her life and promising revenge even from behind bars. 2 bailiffs had to drag her from the courtroom as she continued to threaten everyone who testified against her. Jack felt no satisfaction in Elena's conviction, only relief that she could never hurt anyone else. The trial had forced him to relive the months of manipulation and slow poisoning, and he was grateful to finally close that chapter of his life. The media attention had unexpected consequences for Jack's ranch. Visitors started showing up, drawn by the morbid curiosity of seeing where the Black Widow killer had almost claimed her final victim. At first, Jack was annoyed by the intrusion, but then he realized that some of the visitors were genuinely interested in ranch life rather than just the criminal story. That gave him an idea that would have made Harold Blackwood proud. Jack decided to turn part of his ranch into a working guest operation, offering city people the chance to experience authentic ranch life. It was exactly what Harold had dreamed of doing before Elena cut his life short. In a way, Jack felt like he was fulfilling not just his own dreams, but the dreams of Elena's 5th victim as well. The guest ranch was an immediate success. People came from all over the country to spend a week learning to ride horses, work cattle, and live off the land. Jack hired local cowboys to help with the operation and brought in a cook who could prepare meals that satisfied both ranch hands and city folks. But the best part of the guest ranch was meeting Linda Chen, the veterinarian who'd been recommended to care for the horses Jack purchased for his riding program. Linda was nothing like Elena, honest where Elena had been deceptive, genuine where Elena had been calculating, warm where Elena had been cold. Linda had grown up on a ranch in Wyoming before going to veterinary school, so she understood both the challenges and the rewards of rural life. She was 5 years younger than Jack, with short brown hair and eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled. She wasn't as conventionally beautiful as Elena had been, but her beauty was real rather than manufactured. What attracted Jack most to Linda was her authenticity. She said exactly what she meant, expressed her feelings honestly, and never tried to be anything other than herself. After months of Elena's carefully crafted deceptions, Linda's straightforward personality was like cool water to a man dying of thirst. Their relationship developed slowly and naturally, based on shared interests and genuine compatibility rather than manipulation and lies. Linda would come to the ranch to care for the horses and stay for dinner, talking with Jack about everything from veterinary medicine to childhood memories to dreams for the future. Unlike Elena, who'd seemed to appear out of nowhere with no real past, Linda had deep roots in the community. She'd known Dr. Peterson for years, had grown up with several of the local ranchers, and had a solid reputation built over years of honest work. Jack never had to wonder if Linda was telling him the truth because everything about her life was an open book. When Jack finally worked up the courage to ask Linda to dinner at a restaurant in town, she said yes with a smile that lit up her entire face. Their first official date was nothing like the intense, overwhelming attraction he'd felt with Elena. Instead, it was comfortable and easy, like spending time with someone who could become his best friend as well as his romantic partner. "I've been hoping you'd ask me out for weeks," Linda admitted over dinner. "But I wasn't sure if you were ready to date again after everything you went through with that woman." Jack appreciated Linda's directness. Elena would never have been so honest about her feelings or so considerate of his emotional state. "I wasn't sure either," he admitted. "But spending time with you feels different. Natural. Like something that could actually last." Their courtship lasted almost a year, during which time Jack learned to trust his instincts about people again. Linda never tried to rush him into commitment or push him to change his routine to suit her needs. She had her own veterinary practice to run and her own life to live, which made their time together feel special rather than suffocating. When Jack finally proposed, it was during a sunset ride across his property on a warm evening in June. Linda said yes before he could even finish asking the question, and they were married 3 months later in a simple ceremony held right there on the ranch. The guest ranch thrived under their joint management. Linda's veterinary skills were invaluable in caring for the horses and cattle, while Jack's experience and natural teaching ability made him popular with visitors who wanted to learn about ranch life. They built a successful business that honored both Harold's original vision and Jack's own dreams of creating something meaningful. But more importantly, they built a marriage based on honesty, mutual respect, and genuine love. Linda knew all about Elena and Jack's narrow escape from murder, but she never made him feel like damaged goods or treated him with pity. Instead, she admired his courage in exposing a serial killer and his resilience in rebuilding his life afterward. 2 years after Elena's conviction, Jack received a letter forwarded from the state prison where she was serving her.